Tonight I'm sharing a creepy stories about small town. Please hit the subscribe button and let us know your country and time while you comment. With that, stay relaxed and I shall tell my tale. The North Cemetery is now 200 years old. For this memory, the area in which it is located was an ancient monument before there were even lie in the oldest neighborhoods and parks. This large graveyard has been where thus in life thousands of people were buried. Few families still have their family histories updated nowadays. Thus, the graves of some cemeteries had been emptied as they were allowed new ones in the same places. Where the bodies of some dead had arisen from their graves beforehand are the sunken headstones that have led to the myriads of families affected by the conflict and the hastily closed and opened graves. The onlookers are confused about which dead person the grave was. Most people don't want to know what happened. There are some that would rather not hear it. The land that must belong to the city was got from the government of the Indians. In the earlier times, it was used by the set free roaming before a homestead had been established. Few people among the current population know that there were temples at the old site. The young ones of that time offered ceremonies for the dead. In the same situation our cemeteries have for dead relatives can go in peace according to their religions. When someone dies, loved ones think of them. The Native Americans built the pyramids. They were long dead. Life and death go on. The Pantheon was their first burial ground. At this place, a lot of people try to forget paganism. There are also tales of ghosts in the 1990s. Lonely souls haunt this cemetery. These stories are still told. Some think there are guards among the dead. They look like normal people. They choose their way into the cemetery. When chased, they vanish. Friends and family do not stay in this secluded place at night. Just lonely souls haunt. There was no fear for people living on Earth, according to Ross and Moore. All the earthly matters had been connected. Then the truth broke through the sky. Some truth was in bright stories. People should thank the vast universe. On a dark night, someone was traveling to gain knowledge. A human figure was slowly appearing with a shining light. To be a man means to face death. Then the truth exposes the fiction. Lisset, Nimble Varain, Magic Elf Princess, and others were not bound rule of darkness. They could be called supernatural beings sent to solve problems with magic tricks and power fights. The transformation occurred slowly, starting from the passive woods. First, wild animals noticed strange beings. The first signs were human beings. The mist was hanging and my body of flesh dried off, leaving only chalky. Lorenzo searched the park with a flashlight. He checked for souls wandering around. The tomb field is old. There are tales that changed the city. They feared the dead, but they paid them respect. They want to know the true story. Time lost meaning in that place. It seemed to fly by or stand still. Sometimes, 2 hours passed without Lorenzo knowing. Others felt the same strange flow of time on duty. It felt like it was a Native American burial place. Old stories spoke of that land being strange. Lorenzo told of the horse rider legend. He heard heavy footsteps echoing. The cobblestones made sounds like hooves. People said it was just in his head. But Lorenzo felt lost while searching for where the noise came from. Lorenzo heard some noise, so he tried to figure out what was going on. There was someone on a big black horse making the noise. He wanted to go after the man on the horse, but was scared. It was dark, and the cemetery looked strange. He thought there was only that figure of a man who was a king in the burial place. He saw a black figure coming out from the king's tomb. He considered that it was a great place since he went there to place flowers for his grandmother. Then his nephew was killed in a school accident. The media pressured the safety of the schools, and his elder sister's family was crying about the death. The place where the small boy was buried is in the cemetery where the grandmother is also buried. When I was 20, going back home brought a wave of sadness. The family was close, and grieving was all we felt. I tried to join by ignoring my feeling. I led my children through, only to find a space in a cemetery. As I walked without knowing how long I was being lost, I did not understand how I lost direction. I moved deeper into my sorrows and could not figure out the path to take back home. No sooner had I reached the tombs that it suddenly hit me that all looked the same and had not made progress. Instead, I was lost again. At first, I thought I had made some headway, but after, I began to be angrily helpless and not being seeing a way out. My path disappeared, and I felt lost without directions. The graves are solemn. Every place on board has a specific number in the sky for calming minds close to. There were given places for resting. I longingly wished also lost partners discovered their numbers here. Which many souls are bewildered by loneliness and pain. I got doubts on my purpose of existence on earth. The place around had overwhelming weight that forgot some reliefs, yet there were deaths too. It is no longer possible for me to walk through that cemetery since I begin to notice a strange feeling there. The air is heavy with creepiness, and the tombstones give me a solemn vibe. This has been on my mind recently, how many people have actually passed away or are finding themselves lost in their lives right now. But as the feelings of anxiety take over, especially after the loss of my nephew, the place now feels as if it is crowded with the dead. I felt that I was going crazy and started running aimlessly everywhere without screaming for help. Amidst the clouds blocking the sun, I sat at an old tombstone, about to burst out in emotions as the tree above me provided shade and peace. Suddenly, I heard footsteps coming from another direction, which gave me hope that I might find help. So many questions ran through my mind. Firstly, why did my parents not look for me at all? Secondly, were they either dead or oblivious of my absence? This thought gave me goosebumps, as terror gripped me with a horrible vision of them being dead or something. Following those steps, though, did give me social comfort and hope. But when I arrived at where these sounds came from, there was nothing there, only darkness, followed by a deafening cry somewhere out there in the dark which sounded too much like my voice. It was nighttime, and I could hear a sound. I went toward it, and I saw some lights in the distance. The graveyard was beautiful in the light, but I thought I heard a noise in the distance. It sounded like horses. I wanted to see the riders, but I couldn't see them. Instead, I was just walking around in the graveyard and realized that I might have been seeing something ghostly around. I felt like I was dreaming. Everything seemed very real, but I was also very tired. I finally decided to lay down on the cold ground. It was quite windy and cold, and I felt shivery all over. I wished I had something to cover myself in. I looked at the mausoleums nearby for protection, but there was no way in, so I lay down and started to dream about my family. Somewhere they were probably looking for me because I had been gone for a long time. Who knew how long it had really been? At least 8 hours or more? That was a long time for them not to wonder where I was. I was feeling sorry for myself, but I just wanted to leave this graveyard as soon as possible. I later dozed off. Then at midnight, I woke up to find myself lying under a tree with the stars glimmering above. I felt sleepy and wanted to close my eyes again. I woke up suddenly. I heard a sound like a person whistling far away, but now I thought it was an animal that made the sound. I got up. Then I saw a head peeking from behind a tomb. I saw someone there. My body shivered with fear. I noticed at least 6 or 7 small beings looking at me from among the graves. They were all facing me. I began to run in the opposite direction. In the distance, I could hear giggles and whispers as if they were having fun. I wanted to just run away. I ran to the far end of the cemetery. It was dark and I was alone and afraid. I needed to find someone to help me. I just kept running. Each second felt like it had an eternity. My body felt cold. The fear got into me. The distant laughter followed while I ran away. I hopped about among the graves. My footsteps made loud thumping noises, just like pigs unable to hear for the blast of the wind. All of a sudden, at the alley where I had to be, there seemed to be no one else there. However, it was not their faces I saw under the moon, straight across Cot, that I had none other except God to turn to. When I had my limbs crushed all over me as tight as mean, it is impossible to keep my arms from the fire on my face feeling scorching hot. I went to places that are holy, but saw there was no soul, no shadow or space. Throughout the moon, there was nothing that could carry me fly. Like the rest of it, the body could not be flat. Thus I had no vision at all of God, because others in that instance were not only worshippers of the sheep. In fact, it was very much like my own at its surroundings time. I was so forget that I wasn't able to discern about number. I had to wait for God. I was like a traveler who was not meeting other people on the way despite facing difficulties of life. I was here as his servant. I made a place for worship at Holy Mountain, where I would be close spirit-like to him. I was also concerned to helping others in their spiritual growth. There, they do not care about me. I expected God to give me my own people to serve him. The followers of God, when the time revealed the holy, and God watched that they never passed again through being influenced by satanic ways. Being a follower of Jesus meant that I too was to be like him, evangelist. But this was by the grace of God that made me independent of the sinful ways all. I was thus enabled to visualize only the method of God in the service leaders of the church concerning between the work of cleaning roof, needing only facilities along the church backside outdoors with all that much faith he was serving. Spiritually being nourished, psychologically the provided ones. I passed lead quiet prayerfully and often silently thereto, allowed only one could do requisite meditations. It was difficult at all silence days way. This involved standing being allowed embracing which others cannot lead as positive instead of passively. The affairs of all being free, a sense for the future, of serving men who with worshipping of I God with him that day mowed away. There are also good thoughts about the kings where the evil otters stilling thus, their tension flowing there into my limbs, with imaginations now pleasure enjoying being there. The people had hope strength like I was blind, thus the asking them to go somewhere. I tell them, however, that in such a manner that once I know reply him from him it there to do I, which is to show things. When I came back to the cemetery, there were people already gathered there. I felt both excited and fearful at the same time. I saw some mourners, which led me to think that something tragic happened lately, and therefore I quickly walked over to them. After the burial, I started to wonder how my family managed their grief without me at the funeral of my little nephew. I approached my dad, who told me that they started looking for me when I took too long. They were even about to get help. Just then the phone rang in my pocket, bringing memories of everything I have been through lately. I was very tired, such that I felt the burden on my shoulders being too heavy. I couldn't comprehend how things got off hand so fast in just a short time. كنشك بأننا لن نكون مدركين من نفسه أحداث الحدث الثاني للأذهي. I got really chatty when I wandered around that old graveyard. I sought to piece together what occurred back in 2014 and if it had any relation to that northern spot in town. So I probed the locals, or what they knew about some tales there, because I came upon the legend of Don Lorenzo. Thus, as a part of that site's history, it conveys that there is a dark shadowy, for the people believe there are monsters dwelling around. The local gods subsequently ruled this area for their own special sacred purposes, like controlling the wall, whereby ghosts only reveal to a few people what they say. They will talk to some us, so it told me that magic wasn't just acting by those walls, but also this strange place. One story I was told about my first escape from there has founded by belief in mental healing. I typically held a meditation each time I wanted to detach or slow down on the inner talk, thus assisting me think of benefits running away from such confines, including judging only on what appears at the surface, yet there exists higher meanings beyond, hence letting oneself be absorbed in experiences and obtaining lessons of life's deep mysteries which cannot be perceived as mere human beings. The other day I reconnected with my joy of childhood days. I was going to Mexico City to meet my wife's family. First, I stopped at my birthplace near the border with Mexico. I lived there for a long time. It made me very culturally deep since I would grow older than it affected my life. Even though I have to consider it a hometown, I have lots of memories. The night was dreadful. It was in October when the town was forbidden. I was in a quiet place with no one around. It was the eve of the Day of the Dead. My sister was expecting a baby and we were all nervous as a family. I was happy to be called an uncle. When my sister opened the door and I saw her, I saw fright. She was not supposed to be there. Labor pains had started. Her husband was in the fields working. She attempted to summon a midwife, but she had to give birth at home. That was the scariest, worst time of her life. She finally had her baby. All the crying made her feel grateful for all the pain. Though worn out, she laid her baby in the crib and slept. Suddenly, a loud party with fireworks woke her up. Laughter and whispers were heard as someone was turning down the slow tape. The sounds frightened her a lot. making her think it was a bird on the roof. It was unbearable. The shadows on the walls came alive, and frightful creatures seemed to appear from the walls. The little girl who had been sleeping started to scream. The baby's cries mixed with terrifying things. My sister became very anxious. I wanted to calm her down, but the fright seemed to fill the room. Something felt like it was choking us. We heard a strange noise coming from somewhere in that old room. It was like something was creaking in a creepy way. My sister was so frightened as the nostalgic of a chain broke down suddenly behind her back. An ugly old woman with a big white bulb appeared. She was very scary, but something strange happened. It was all just in her imagination. We were frightened as hell. It looked as if I was in a nightmarish movie. The night of the cyborgs was coming, according to the news that I heard. Somehow, I told myself that this might not have been real. It was blazing hot that night, and I could not sleep. My family was summoned for the little girl in the old lady's house. I felt so terrified as I imagined myself as the little girl. I was crying. My family already had come. They thought it would be best for my sister not to sleep alone, so I went to call her. But when I got to her home, the door was open. I went inside and found my sister trembling. A blood-stained blanket was wrapped around her. My sister said it was her baby's, but just how could it have blood? I wished I could not have been there instead of it being a nightmare. We had to stand still, feeling helpless in nature. That evening, as the horror had come true, luck had gone on my cute girlfriend's fate. My memories of the past are hazy. I was watching her through the window. Suddenly, she disappeared from my view without moving. I had no idea what was happening. The house was small. It was far from the town. I just thought about my sisters who looked like they had been kidnapped. When I was a teenager, there was a rumor in the town about my missing sister. Information travels fast like fire. There was fear in the night. They had their own suspicions. Darkness is not very safe. We were just mumbling and sighed heavily after hearing what had happened. As a result, stories of witches began to spread like wildfire. There was a real panic. People carried out their activities in a very cautious manner. They kept their windows locked. They lit fires in their homes. It became so cold. The street became deserted. I was afraid. I thought there were bad spirits around. They were looking for my sister. There were emergency calls placed when witchcraft was suspected. Local authorities only responded by calling witch hunters. They didn't really listen. People were upset and mistrusted the news of a lack of babies being born. It seemed like a ghost town. My sister and her husband moved out due to the unrest. My father would not leave his home of many years. More villagers left soon, leaving only a few behind. Teresa was the youngest and only girl among them. The baby just born had never left home before. She felt scared of losing her baby. Other mothers with babies were protecting them. Finally, they decided to trust in her witchcraft and knowledge of Santa Rita to save the baby. Teresa had always kept the baby in a circle of salt. In the moonlight that night, the barking dogs were trying to warn her, but she did not know that. Suddenly, the dogs started howling from across the trail, and that made the lady feel even worse, and she became unable to be at peace. She started praying to Mary and the saints too, holding her rosary tightly in her hand. Then, huge shadows started coming over, the room filled with a bad smell. Jesus' wisdom and the spirit of a pure soul were working together. The door almost broke down, thus exposing Teresa to danger. The door started clicking as two scary creatures, a hooded figure and one-eyed monster, wanted to reveal themselves. The other side of the glass above Deborah's head was changing shape. Meanwhile, the hooded figure with one eye showed up, laughing frighteningly at Teresa. Her prayers were her only connection with the Lord and kept on praying. Each prayer she said was like a torch lighting up the darkness. The rosary in the dark shadow felt cold, but suddenly it got warm as the room started feeling hot for newborn babies, and Teresa never realized the witch was there. The witch got angry at Teresa's love and prayer while she made use of her sharp nails and claws trying to reach her. However, it was the love from God that was making Teresa very strong, and so she kept on praying wearily as time seemed so lengthy. Teresa prayed hard. She trembled as the big woman came in. They had to leave when daylight came. Teresa was holding on to the witch's promise of the son for her child. She was paralyzed by fear as she prayed for hours. Finally, exhausted, she kneeled and thanked God for safety. The air was clear with the light. The witch stopped her visions for some days. One night, while going home, I felt tense about my lost flock. Surprisingly, there was no smoke, so I thought my dad was wrong, yet fear held me back. I didn't want to lose any sheep. I heard the evil woman's voice nearby. I couldn't see her face. I felt scared for some reason. It made me uneasy and frightened. It seemed that time went slowly when I was lost, yet others thought it was a long time. One evening while my sheep were grazing, I was also by myself in the open space. I awoke at night, not knowing how I got there. I coughed terribly and was in great pain. Thus, I felt like having a bad dream. I just wished to open my eyes in reality, but my thoughts were getting more and more muddled in relation to that. As I stepped forward towards home, I found it hard to move my feet. Naturally, I felt like walking in my own dreams. Those memories of that lady, together with the croaking of her voice, suddenly appeared, but I was not so sure whether they were true or imaginary or just fables created by my troubled mind. I believed I had to keep my hands on the living because now was the occasion when I needed them most to calm my thoughts down. Though I was there in body, spirit and mind, I felt numb and all alone in the obsidian void that seemed to envelop me. Suddenly, I found I was in a small town that was on the edge of the village that I didn't know existed before today. So surprised was I by the lack of stars in the sky above me that I would have thought that they had gone out. Just then, I heard voices murmuring nearby and began half-heartedly to search for firelight, finding it only a few feet away where most of my relatives were gathered around the campfire. They were standing very close together, huddled like frightened sheep, yet it took me some moments before recognizing them as such. All I saw was a strange face belonging to the officer who was in charge of them imprisonment. After I woke from this terrible dream with my family having not been abandoned but having hidden themselves into caves, having become visible again at last, what happened afterwards seemed to be unreal. During our talk with my father, I could remember nothing except for one thing, which was that I was hitting my head hard every time an old image rotated into the mind, and I could not see anything. Then I was absolutely in darkness. It was as though I had become a prisoner locked up somewhere behind bars. A week later, the boy's kidnapper was found. I was with the other shepherds, but too scared, and I thought only of the boy. I recall a blurry image of my worried parents and a wailing baby. It was hard to imagine what they said. I couldn't see over my shaking hands. My plan was to wait for Teresa's moment of distraction before sneaking in and taking the baby. When Teresa turned away as she was feeding the baby, I seized the chance and quickly grabbed the baby from the crib. The baby was fast asleep. Teresa was soon out of the house to be seen and said, so I was running with a speed beyond that of any living adult. And as I arrived at the foot of the hill, an old woman was there waiting for me with the village after I had given her the baby. There were village witnesses who claimed they could not believe their eyes. Later on, tributes were slow to be done. They said they saw that the old lady took the infant into the forest and disappeared. Teresa cried when they called me. I also got lost in the bush for days. At dawn, worried villagers climbed the hill. They looked in vain for the baby. They went back home, but no one had returned. My parents had tried so hard to tell the detectives that it wasn't my fault. Panic took over, and they turned their fears into evidence against me. My trial was hopeless. There was no evidence, but the town needed someone to blame. They sent me to a juvenile facility for a crime I did not commit. While I was locked up, the town got crazier. Rumors spread that a demon was stealing babies and selling their souls. My family was blamed for being the witch's partner. This was right after the guild left. Only a few remained. The town was sloppy. Some men climbed the hill to see the witch, but they never returned. The story of the witch became mixed with travelers' tales. My heart is scared, like a ghost from the past. The town is gone now. Just old buildings remain. Their echoes haunt my mind. Music. One day I went to a small town that I had never been to before. It was located in Indiana. This town was quiet and lonely. Some odd tales were told by the townspeople about the place. I was there as a research assistant. My supervisors had sent me to this town that was far up in the hills. The only odd stories that were recounted by some folks are sometimes weird tales were being told by some people, as I was to ensure that we would have enough food to eat. We stayed there from Friday night to Monday morning. On the other hand, this lady and her sister-in-law have given us a house to live in. When they let us stay there, we were supposed to help with some repair work. Since there were only a few finishing touches left to be done, we did not take so long in accomplishing that job. On the shores of the lake, the town actually felt very homely. It was similar to the neighboring small towns. I easily forgot about the many small towns that were here and there until I only got to know them by name. While the town was very close, due to the fact that the driver had gone around a corner to come to this little town, it looked like a tiny dot which had only around 50 houses scattered along the lake. Our own lodge was located atop a hill from where I could see the entire lake and all these houses. At times, after completing daily survey tasks, it was fun for me to be on the balcony unwinding. This usually was at night, since we worked a lot during the nighttime. On one particular day, I was outside. I thought I heard church bells ringing. It was surprising being there. Rang at that hour sounded like a signal from church was going to be started soon. Local inquiry followed. What was the connection of sounds from that temple to the chimes of that soul one? I spent some time trying to get a right answer about the bells of that temple. I found nothing as I waited. The only thing remaining was to hit the bed. When we shared breakfast at Frey's house next morning, I asked about the midnight chimes. They were surprised, and I was also surprised. At the time, that temple had no bell at all. There was none. Like these were really strange, as with the chimes it was going rather to be that tolling bell coming from somewhere else. It was quite a frightful story as described by Lainey, who said that it was a sunken village at the bottom of still that watery pit, like that lake. A place where people had cast a spell, thus causing the ringing forth when someone was dying of that village. They never went up to heaven. That scared me. However, in my mind, I kept on learning some stuff. I did not like that chime bell stuff. It so happened that we left for town that morning, but were still thinking of what occurred during the previous night. Just then, we ran into some people who had gathered near the church. Reached the limits of the crowd and got close to know what was happening. Tickets were bought. We were sitting in total silence for quite some time as an old man came and informed us of the death of Don Furman, who was well respected around. Hence what we had heard last night about his good health, however. This morning, he was found dead. Now, no one could tell mainly the cause of such a death. We saw others crying. The parish priest was sent over there. He needed nothing but anointing them to ease his soul. It was as if his wife Frey was musing over mind reading during the chime times when Don Furman was on the verge of passing on. Quite often, I found myself with them as we discussed the notion of being able to read minds. Then we said goodbye. We had to go back to work. Nevertheless, the weight of that day was too heavy for us. Getting to the places proved to be difficult as usual. There were no questions left unanswered because today nothing was bothering us as only Don had died. We felt uneasy and only the sound of the bells was unpleasant to us, that it troubled but did not console. I inquired from the people whether at one point had tried to hear others' bells ring, and told me that on that day there was not anybody who could have been out there ringing them. By that measure, we settled down for outside and discussed with the people about it until we received some news. A father affirmed that he would heal them by some magic, but for the dead to die violently was the only way for it. They needed really to kill themselves, being a skeptic. However, because the father might have used herbs and prayers. So I asked people around him what were the prayers which he used. They told me using herbs and prayers, and that only serious black magic was carried out at a greater cost, forbidding me from being told any other things, since apparently they were already frightened enough. I didn't mention that I too was vouching for the chimes at this hour. As dismay grew stronger by that evening, there resounded in my head the horns of the bells, and I thought maybe there was more than legend by the air being carried, fears besides superstitions which I had bought as if some evil thing lay at the shores of the lake. Some people hadn't heard any chimes at midnight, but those who had gone to bed early that night for less were found awake, so I did not pay much mind to it since we returned back to town on that annoying Friday. The town still remained the subject of discussion, thus people fairly calmed down, So we resumed our daily operations. After telling them I would be there at the balcony that night, I prepared my binoculars and opened wide, in order not to miss out on anything as I looked through, if there were lights within that area. But it was a dark night. I could not see anything. I thought I saw a temple across the lake. I stared until my eyes shut. I heard a humming noise outside. I stood still. It got louder. I thought it's a drunk dude, but felt uncomfortable. I took my binoculars to see who's making the noise, but it was dark. All I heard was a splash of water, like a guy coming out or going under the water. I ran to my boyfriend. My heart beat fast. I told him how I heard a voice from the lake that scared me. I worried it's a drunk guy who may drown in it. I still tried to see the lake, but my mind said they should check it out. He said that we should wait until daybreak since there was no road through the lake. I gave in after a while. I usually get up very early in the morning around 4. I went back to look through the window the following day I woke up. The lake was bright blue and still. I heard friends talking in the afternoon, so it was only scary noises they made last night. They said that there were also spirits of the dead in the area. If these people were lost, they'd be around too. I told Fred about the weird sound I heard last night, so Fred was scared and recommended we should head back home early so as not to go outside at night. Fred told us that no one had seen anything in the lake, but midnight was the time spirits or sat-like beings were passing by. Sometimes they asked someone for help, but that spirit took their soul in exchange. It seemed not to like adults, but loved children or young souls more. Wise Fred told us not to go to the lake again at night for our safety. The story sounded strange though. I began to feel uneasy about it while walking up the hill later on. It was dark with only a few distant lights around, and I had to use my phone torch not to trip when something suddenly went off in the bushes while I was watching my friends. I was scared that night by strange spell sounds. I heard rustles outside. Mount Mine played tricks on me as I wondered what went on out there. I grabbed the curtain tightly as I gazed into the wind bending the leaves here and there. The peculiar sound made me anxious. I felt like running away, but my limbs froze. That did not stop the fear of whatever might be lurking outside. The sea roared like it wanted to swallow shore. I closed my ears and tried to sleep. Just then the clock chimed. I woke up as everybody was talking in hushed tones. I had drifted into a very deep sleep. The wind howled while drumming against my window pane seemed not to relent. That tall silhouette at the corner of my fleshy bride's eye let go of the curtains, leaving behind its dreaded figure outside, dancing silly in huge shadows. Was so scared, tense the whole night with my legs under me, wondering if the beast would suddenly appear and peep inside. Just lounging around, and then someone mentioned one person was missing. Fred thought Jeffrey the carpenter's son was left out. One pal, Ander, said Jeffrey got totally plastered. He yelled there was nothing in the lake to frighten him, so he went for a swim. He bragged about swimming. When they declined, pesky Jeffrey cussed that going away friends would do not follow. After that, he did not go back home. At dawn, they looked for him where his pals were but could not find him. The fishermen had to crack on with hoisting methodically. And so, fishing day started, everyone else then enjoying themselves. Meanwhile, Jeff reaped the silver fish, did learn of a line tipped out. Finally, after Enclamp, they had to snab of dead machine lifeblood, cut lengths, elite the head escaped brain. The men rushed to the seashore for the fishermen to help in a search for him. The fishermen safely returned Jeffrey home. At sunset, they had relieved him of shoes, yet was causing the searchers to believe suddenly he drowned. The following day, but had their heads hot, as well as tried finding it all day, but they were too sad besides worn out. They finally debated with parents. When it had been as such, decided that son had died, the mother said, pleaded wanting not to know any more of him, which did not bother her anyhow. Even though that night was very deadly, we decided to continue. It was that every weekend we could rush to the house before dark, as all of us were in bad moods, including getting tired over Jeffrey Brain tortured and creative quarrels. But my family preferred weekends. It was easier relieving some pressure which came anyhow along with feeling to blame myself. Sometimes I caught myself thinking maybe I was only imagining my brother was dead, simply because he then ran away. On purpose for peace, I always got this hope. He could still be alive, at least according to how I thought about it. such that no body discovery would be a big. Jay never gave up wishing someday he would be found, but counting days meant nothing, only showing they were missing a husband. Some folks from the city had a chance to experience the fair in the town. I asked some locals nearby about the history of the town that was once submerged. In the evening, we sat with a guy named Fry and his wife. She convinced him to share the story. He said that during heavy rains, the lake water was quite high. At that time, the village nearby were only two very close to the land already there was, however. This time, the water level rose, completely covering this area, and that the tales of the town were said to have been allocated the first time his folk had heard it. The elders would share tales when they saw the water level dropping. Fry told us a dark story about a fishing ghost. The villagers made a deal with the lake spirit. The spirit would grant the villagers wishes. In return, they had to sacrifice their lives. At midnight, the spirit would collect them in the depths of the lake for the deal to work. This made that case. The creature I called to came from evil. I was sure he could do this task, and so my journey started. Books were the source of my ideas. I had theory for this job, hence it was not hard to do it practically. I saw the entrance of the lake was broad like a man's sewer. It narrowed as it was going downwards. I entered that way, yet I was underwater and thus could not hold breath. I then dived deeper. The water was darker and colder. That was the first spell which cooled my cell inside. For long I let my being drift with the current. The sweet mountain voice I think I heard at last. Luckily, I did not come across them after all. I emerged from the lake and lay down upon the burning shores. Afterwards home, I slept without concern, but this morning too early I woke and thought again. This time even, stress could not be enough to do that thing. I was finally shaking. Immediately an idea came into my sick mind. The map I went with much enthusiasm. I flew to my house at June is the date I booked for my flight then. On that day, I would try and come upon this way. I made some dots on it. That path was the one. Arrived at the grove with mark number 1 after long walk there. The path was grave-like. It led me a long distance. When first it was, I sighted a small 30 centimeters or 9 years old grand tree, whose kind did not belong to dwelling of caves. Then the usual jungle yellow, brown, red trees were changing. I found myself among them, I uttered. A fisherman made a deal with the spirit of the lake. If he saw the fish first, he would catch them. He then remembered that his dog was with him at the lake. This made him happy. He caught many fish and was grateful to the spirit, Sate. On his way back, he thought of his son's gesture and was moved as he warned him to avoid the lakeside because he had talked to Sate. He suddenly left the boy far away from the lake shore as he had suggested earlier. Years later, the fisherman had a son who remembered this. That night, against his father's warnings, the boy went to the same lakeside. He viewed the shining stars and the dad was not conscious of the boy in the water as he plunged in without realizing it. Temples made a loud noise, but no one heard it because the father was the only one unaware of the boy's disappearance in the water. I thought of my brother and got scared. My mind was getting elsewhere. Maybe this was about local beliefs and folklore. We were telling stories before return to our homes. I was thinking about what happened in the lake. Was it just coincidence, or was it something more? The doubt would follow me even when I left the town.